Welcome back to another video, guys. In this one we're going to take a look at some basic campcraft skills. So welcome back, guys. Thank you very much for joining me once again today. Briefly before we get started, I just want to apologise for the past 2 weeks there being no videos. I've been away and haven't had a chance to film, but we're back out now and we're going to get back on schedule. So as I say, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some basic campcraft skills, in particular ways of suspending a pot over a campfire. So we're going to look at 3 different methods, right from a really simple, getting more complicated, and I'm going to show you through how we're going to do that. We're out in a lovely mixed woodland here. We're going to be working with green sycamore for this. Green wood is of course what we want to be using for stuff near fires so it doesn't burn, and sycamore happens to be what I have readily available and is fairly invasive in the area that I'm in, and there is millions of it, so cutting green sycamore is okay. So what we're going to be using today in terms of equipment, fairly simple. I've got my Baco Laplander saw, which is what I've prepped the wood with here, and is also what I'm going to be using throughout. I've got my TBS bore bushcraft knife, which I'll be doing a lot of the cuts with, and I have also got my Gransfors Bruks small forest axe, should we decide to use that, but it's not really necessary. We can get away with just a knife and a saw. And we will use a little bit of cordage later on, but we'll get to that. So without further ado, let's get into our first pot hanger method, our basic, super simple one stick pot hanger. So we're going to start with the most simple pot hanger we can realistically pull together, and it only involves one stick. And basically we're going to hang the pot on one end and stick the other end into the ground. So I've got a bit of sycamore here. It's probably a slight bit too thick, certainly at the bottom end, but it's what I've got, and it's about, I don't know, just over half of my arm span. You know, maybe 3.5 feet here. And what we're going to need to do first of all is figure out what way it wants to sit, because as you can see there's a bit of a curve in this, and so on the one hand it kind of wants to sit that way, but if we actually look, it wants to sit upside down like that, which probably isn't ideal for what we're wanting, but it will work. So what that means is that we know that this is the top of our bit of wood with it sitting that way. So let's just mark that with a cut, so we know that that is the top. And then at the bottom end we want to put a point on it. Now with how thick this wood is, we might want to just use the axe for this, which is exactly what I'm going to do. So we'll use the axe to put a point on it, just because this wood's so thick and quite dense that it'll take me ages with my knife to do. So let's grab the axe. I've got a proper stump to work with here, but this is what I've got that's best. So this side here is one face, and we'll start on that side, and we'll taper that down like so, and then we'll come to another side. Now remember, a point requires a minimum of 3 sides. To make a point. And there we go, there's a point. So we've got our point now on this end, and that will get stabbed into the ground that way, and it's going to sit like this. But then at the top, we need some way to hold our pot, because currently, if we tried to hang our pot on there, it's just going to slide down the pole. So we're going to carve a notch, and in this case I'm going to carve it between these two knots in here. And the type of notch we're going to carve is what's referred to as a 7 notch, and it's the first of 2 types of notches that we're going to do today. The 7 notch is simply a stop cut into. So I'm going to, on the side that it wants to sit, I'm going to lay the stick down, place my knife horizontally across it, and baton my knife in to create a stop cut. And then we're going to cut gently up to it. We can cut away any bits that stick. Now, bushcraft is all about finesse, so take your time doing these kinds of things and make it as good as you can. And we want this notch not overly deep, because it doesn't need to be, but it needs to be deep enough to hold the bail of our pot. And we will demonstrate with a pot, with a couple of different pots, these pot hangers working. And that there is probably enough, and you can kind of see why it's named a 7 notch. It's not really looks like a 7, but it roughly looks like a 7. Now these can be put together really quickly as well. So then, if your fire is going to be here, you're going to jab this into the ground, and you're going to, well, what we can do to stop it mushrooming out at the top is we can just put a chamfer around the top, and I tend to double chamfer. And there we go. So what we can do, jab that into the ground. Now, you need to figure out your angle, and a good way to do that is to get your pot. So let me go ahead and grab a pot. So I've got 2 different pots that we can play around with. So I've got my titanium pot, and I've got my zebra billy can, and both will work. So for example, that'll sit there. But you can see, of course, with that bale, it's really quite high and close to the wood. It doesn't want to sit perfectly. It's not ideal, but it'll work. And we can see that that would probably want to be quite low, so it wouldn't work overly well. Because we've got to remember that this, the lower this is, the closer to the surface this end is going to be, and it might break out. Whereas with something with a slightly larger bale, zebra billy can, we can probably get away with fire and an angle about that there. So we can find our angle and jab it in, and then we can get our baton and there we go. Now that goes on there, fire underneath. Now you might be saying that this pot is empty, and it is, so we'll test it with some water in it. So that's a litre of water in our billy can, and we'll test this. Bada bing, bada boom, working fine. Now that's not a lot of room for a fire, so we could of course raise it higher, but small fire. If you're worried, because in soft ground with a heavy enough pot, this can bend into the ground and slowly sink. If you're worried about that, what you can do is just stick a stick there, and that distributes the load and it won't go anywhere. You can have your fire, your pot will sit there, and Bob's your uncle. This is our very basic pot hanger that only really needs one stick, maybe two if you feel that you need it. But of course there's some limits to this. Now one benefit is of course that it can be put together really quickly. But of course, some of your negatives, you can only have a small fire, because if you get a big fire, this is going to start to burn. Even though it's green, it could still burn. And you're relatively limited on the size of pot in which you can hang, and there is no adjustability at all, other than you can kind of lift this up slightly and pin the stick slightly further back. But realistically, it's set it and leave it, but for a quick fire, this would work fine. So that was our simple one stick pot hanger, but we're going to move on to a slightly more elaborate and slightly more adjustable pot hanger now. So for this we need 4 pieces of wood. We need 2 what we refer to as tick shapes. Now I've got one quite chunky but short one, and a thinner one here. Now, one of these is going to be a peg, and in this case I'm going to use this one. And this will be our adjustable pot hanger, which we'll come back to. We need a fork stick that's quite long. And probably it won't need to be quite this long, we'll cut it down. And then we need a long, straight pole. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our fork stick. We're going to tidy it up, we'll chamfer the tops to make it nicer, and we'll put a point on the bottom. Now, before we put a point on our fork stick here, we need to know how high it needs to be. So to do that, we're going to hold, our fire's going to be here, and we need to hold our long piece to roughly how high we're going to want it, and realistically, so that's going to go a bit further back, because we want the end of this roughly over our fire, and then our stick about a step back, and we want it about that tall. So what we can do is flip this around and then add a little bit to figure out, because we're going to need that spike, and then it will go in the ground to about there. So I'm just going to put a mark here, which is about how high it will need to be out the ground, and then we'll cut it off about there using the Laplander. And we'll put a spike on that, but again, don't need to show you putting spikes onto things. So at the same time, what I've done is I've just put my spike on my little peg as well. Axe mask on, keep us safe. So, we've got our pole here. we're going to have a fork stick, and we want, if our fire is going to be here, we want about a step back to our fork stick, and I'm going to try and drive that into the ground. And then, because this is like an actual Y, because this is an actual Y here, we need to be careful that we don't split it. And there we go. So then this will sit in here, like so. And again, we want to see what way this is going to sit. And it wants to sit this way round. So then, at the top, what we want to do is take this off the way it wants to sit, mark the top like so, and we will go ahead and do a little bit to that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this stick, we're going to take our knife, and we're going to thin down the top here. Now, I'm going to swap sides and use the chest lever grip and get a little bit more power. And we want to thin it down from both sides to a screwdriver style end. Now we don't want it too thin because it will break, but we want it thin enough that it will hold what we want to do with it. And we can just chamfer off the ends, and then we want to cut in we want to cut in a little notch in the center. Or we can almost drill in a little notch if necessary. Like so. And there we go. I'm just going to tidy this up slightly. And there we go. And that's that piece done. So this gets rested in our fork roughly in line with our fire. So now we're going to come to this piece, and we're going to do an adjustable pot hanger. So first of all, this is a little bit long, so we'll cut that shorter because it just needs to be a little hook that will take and hold the bail of our pot. And then what we're going to cut is a series of beak notched, series. So once we've done that, what we need to do is carve a series of notches into this, and we're going to use the second type of notch, which is the beak notch. So what we can do is, if we get our pot and I'm just going to use my zebra here, that's going to hook on there. Now, in terms of balancing, first of all we want the notches on the same side as the hook, and we can figure out what's the lowest that that's going to be, and I reckon it's going to be about there. So we can just put a tiny little mark so we know where that's going to be. And where's the highest? Well, probably we might want one up here somewhere. So we're going to carve 2 beak notches. Now, beak notch is called a beak notch because it looks like a beak, like a bird's beak. So, first of all, we need to think about a couple of things. What we're doing is we're creating a point on the stick. And in this case, we want to make sure that the point is pointing towards our hook at this end, so that when we hang it, it hangs on the beak. So to do this, first of all, let's make sure we're on the center line. And we're going to lay our knife across our wood at an angle, like so. And we're going to baton in. You don't need to baton, but if I find it easier. And we're going to make sure that that is fairly deep. And then we're going to baton the other way, creating an X shape. Oops. And there we can see our X. And then what we're going to do is just gently cut up to that X. And there's no undercutting involved. We're going to cut up, and then we might have to cut it out and cut up and cut up until we get a nice deep beak notch. So in the end, that's what our beak notch looks like. Now we can do another one further down, but I'll rattle through that later on. We don't really need to do that right this second. So then what this means is this beak fits into that notch that we carved in the top, and if we put some weight on it, it'll sit. Now, because this pole isn't pinned down, one of 2 things kind of wants to happen. 1, the back end might want to lift, and 2, this pole's actually trying to spin. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and peg down, using our peg, the back of the pole, and it'll sit in place. And then hook our pot onto our pot hanger. And there we are. So there is our pot hanger. Now if we have a second notch, what we can then do is raise it up to there or bring it down. I've probably put this fork stick slightly too close, or we could shuffle this along. Small fire would be alright. Now what a lot of people do is they cut this off here at this point, but that makes it less likely to work. We want this bit up here for the counterbalance, and it also gives us a handle for lifting us on and off of the fire, which comes in rather handy. So obviously we've got our more adjustable pot hanger here, but what if we've got a slightly more permanent camp? So those first 2 options are good. If we've got a really quick fire, we can use our simple 1-stick pot hanger. Whatever. If we've got maybe a couple of days at most, or even a more elaborate overnight, we could pull together this more adjustable one. But what happens if we've got a slightly more permanent camp and we want to be hanging large kettles and Dutch ovens and things? Our best option is a tripod. Now, a lot of people, you'll see, and I've done it, get 3 straight sticks, lash them together, you've got a tripod. But there's actually, now I've not managed to fully do this today, but there's this cheat way to do it in which, by using forked sticks, you don't need as much lashing. Now I think these are a little bit long, these sticks, so if we cut them, let's see, actually, no, we're all good. So what I have got today is I've got 2 forked sticks here, so they will lock together like so. And then what I've got is I've got a third straight pole that doesn't have a fork that will go falling apart here. So we've got 2 forks and a straight pole. Now let's see where we can get this to sit in. I wonder if I can get that to go in between like so, and get you in there, and immediately this has a lot of structure. Now we're probably going to want to adjust this slightly as best as we can without it falling apart. And there we go. Now it's going to slide up and down that pole, but there's a tripod. Now because we've only got 3 poles, 2 forked poles, we're going to do a lashing, so I'm just going to do a clove hitch to start with. I'm just going to do a clove hitch around the 3 poles to start with. We can just and then I'm just going to wrap it nice and tight with our cord, and then tie off with a clove hitch as well. Of course you could do this with natural cordage and everything. So there we are, there is a tripod. You can have our fire in the middle. Now what you might be saying is how you hang in the pot. So we've got kind of a couple of options as to how we could do this for hanging something underneath this. First of all, we could get ourselves a stick. There we go. Not quite like that, more like that. So we could get ourselves a little stick and we can tie our cord to our stick. Round turn and 2 half hitches is always a good option. Maybe slightly high, but we'll see. And we can then just tuck that back up to there, for example. And if we take our pot, what we can do, whoops, is just put our toggle through and hang our pot. That's one method. So that we can make adjustable in different ways and things. But another option is to make use of our adjustable pot hanger from earlier. By simply creating a loop with our paracord, if I can untie it. So we take our adjustable pot hanger with our pot on it, so we know roughly how high. Say about there. So good. So I want a loop about here. So all I'm going to do is just tie figure 8 on a bite. That's maybe, let's see, is that too high up? Might be fine. And we can just take our second half of the cord and just tie it off. Tie it off up here. And then if we pick up our pot with our pot hanger, we just use that loop, should bite in. There you go. And there's another option. So there's lots of different ways we could do this. We could put a taut line hitch into this cord so it's adjustable. All sorts of things. Be aware though, of course, that paracord will melt over a fire, which is why we want a stick if possible. But yeah, there we go. That is option number 3, is the full tripod, which again, certainly with green wood, you can hang a lot of weight off of this. And of course, the benefit of a tripod is then we've also got room to dry things on it. We can raise stuff really up high and smoke things with a tripod. Lots of different options. There we go. So that is 3 different ways of suspending a pot above a fire in the woods, etc. Hope you learned something from this video, and that's going to do it for this one. So if you liked it, make sure to leave a like down below, and if you're new here, please do consider subscribing as well. Leave a comment of what you want to see next, and until next time, bye for now.